He walked in like nothing had happened, and without looking me in the face, slid a lawyer's business card across the kitchen table. Her arm was around his, my childhood friend, smiling in a way that used to be reserved for birthday candles and shared secrets. For a second, the room felt too small. The card sat between us, glossy and ordinary, as if that made it less final. I put my mug down slowly, watched the steam stop curling, and said, "If that's what you want, fine." That was the moment everything condensed into a single clear image. Paper, a warm arm, the slow, practiced ease of someone who'd been rehearsing indifference. You might expect a scream, a slap, a dramatic pleading. I had words, but they were quiet, measured. I didn't need spectacle. I needed time. He didn't know I had already planned for time. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about how designs you quietly build for yourself become the thing that steadies you when the world shifts. If you want the full story behind how this unfolded, stay with me. We'd known each other since we were kids. John, Emily, and I were the sort of trio that shared backpacks and swapped hair barrettes. We climbed through neighborhood trees and stayed out past porch lights, swearing we'd always be there for one another. He and I fell in love in a way that felt inevitable, slow, like a line drawing that finally found its shading. We married in our mid-20s, small ceremony, a potluck of friends, and I thought I'd stepped into a life I'd sketched in the margins of notebooks. Emily and George had found each other too, not in the dramatic way you only read about, but in the small, steady way. College study groups, late-night coffee, a chemistry that fit. She helped me pick my wedding dress. George taught my daughter to ride a bike. For a long time, the four of us were an extended, messy, seamless family. Vacations to low, windswept beaches, barbecues that lasted until the stars came out, the kind of ease that makes you assume it'll always be like that. The first real crack came with a pregnancy announcement. Emily's was the kind of joy that made us all lean in. She called me crying on the porch. She'd wanted a child for so long. John started showing up at appointments with more than the usual friends' enthusiasm. He switched to decaf, started researching baby names with an intense seriousness that was almost theatrical. He painted a tiny dresser that he'd never painted for our daughter's old room. Little things that could have been explained away, extra phone calls, late-night texts, began to gather around them like birds at the feeder. It's funny how betrayal rarely enters with loud alarms. It slides in on tiny conveniences. He took to attending Emma's school plays, clapped the loudest at Christmas concerts, sat in the front row at the kindergarten graduation when I'd been the one who'd signed her up. When I asked him about it, he smiled like he was helping the obvious. "She needs a father figure," he told me once, as if the sentence had no edges. I felt the floor beneath me move. Emily's pregnancy changed the angles of everyone around her. She was ecstatic, of course, bubbling, radiant. But there were also decisions she made that didn't include anyone else. Lunches that turned into dinners with John, whispered phone calls, excuses that bent but didn't break. George came to me with worry lines I didn't recognize on his face. He said, "I don't want to make things worse. I just feel settled out." We started to notice patterns. Hotel stays that showed up as purchases on shared calendars, GPS pinging at places that weren't listed for work. We did what people do when the evidence discreetly piles up. We gathered it. We didn't want to destroy a child's sense of security or make a mess for a little person who deserved better than our adult chaos. So we were careful. We set our aim not on punishment, but on clarity. Proof that could be used when it had to be, not for revenge on a whim. We promised, between late-night cups of coffee and whispered plans, that we would protect the child at all costs. That meant waiting, watching, recording the truth without letting the child feel the tremor beneath the floor. I can be suspicious. Maybe that's part of being an illustrator. You notice the small misalignments in a picture. I was also someone quietly building something besides my marriage, stories and pictures that felt like they belonged to me. I started writing children's books the way some people plant tomatoes, patiently, with a low expectation at first. Imagined characters lived in my drawer, little manuscripts folded under embroidery. I submitted and was rejected and kept submitting. Rejection is a quiet teacher. It teaches you to sear your private joys with internal cord so they don't go up in someone else's toast. The thing about small triumphs is that they can be invisible to the people closest to you. John knew I was sketching in the evenings. He thought of it as my hobby, the safe little project of someone who stops at the day job. He didn't see the pages that turned into contracts, or the meetings I had with an editor who eventually asked for a series. I kept this part of my life private in the way you keep a photograph in your back pocket, close, but not on display. When your marriage is unsteady, it feels almost selfish to claim joy loudly. So I worked in secret, building an income that would later mean more than comfort. It would mean autonomy. Emily's baby, Emma, arrived into a complicated situation, one we had all, at ironed-out points, promised would be protected. As the years passed, Emma grew up wrapped in many hands. John's presence became oddly performative. He knew when to appear at social events, when to be photographed with the stroller, how to offer the kind of tenderness that gets applause. There were times I caught him looking at her with an expression I'd once attributed to the way he looked at me. It wasn't my imagination. It was a real, unsettling familiarity that settled into both of them. The GPS evidence came to light because of something small and practical. George and I were trying to piece together a travel reimbursement that didn't add up. A phone's ping, a list of addresses. They lined up. The dates matched hotel bookings and receipts. We didn't parade it around. We folded it into an envelope and held it like a weapon we chose not to wield in front of a child. When you collect proof, you collect restraint too. Evidence is useful not for spectacle, but for truth. We planned quietly for a future in which Emma would be safe and informed by honest adults, not gaslighting or convenient silences. That promise shaped everything we did. We didn't want to fracture a child's life to soothe our egos. So we waited. We let time pass. We watched as the relationship between John and Emily moved from furtive to familiar to assumed. We let the pattern harden until it was undeniable. In the background, my book started finding a readership. A small, steady income stretched into a modest one, then into something that allowed me to keep a studio and pay a nanny when I accepted longer trips to illustrate. I set aside money, quietly, the way you tuck away a bolt of fabric. It was a ledger of small victories, royalties that trickled in, an animation studio that expressed interest, a licensing conversation that turned a character into plush prototypes. I kept the numbers to myself, not because I wanted to hide from John, but because I needed the money to be mine in a literal sense, a buffer, a safety net. Independence is a slow art. Then came the illness. I confess reluctance to even speak about it. There are things that become nouns because saying them out loud makes them heavier. It was serious enough that I needed long-term hospital care. I don't want to get into specifics. Medical details are not the point. The point is that when your body falters, the true weight of the people around you shows. Some people left rooms as if discomfort were contagious. Some stayed and only knew how to say small, helpless things. John's presence during that time was performative. He came at odd hours, made polite small talk with nurses, took photos that centered himself with a solemn face. When I asked him, honestly and simply, to help with an insurance form, he would sigh and say he'd do it later. In corridors between beeping machines, I learned who was there because love required labor, and who was there for the optics. When he handed me the lawyer's card, it was not a momentary lapse, but a culmination. The card wasn't just paper. It was the physical evidence of a decision he wanted to make the moment it was convenient for him to claim virtue. Standing there, in a hospital gown that made me feel vulnerable in the literal sense, I could have matched his spectacle with my own. But that wasn't my aim. He expected a scene. He expected to watch me lose my composure. Instead, I said yes. It's strange to describe agreeing to a divorce as a power move because it felt like survival more than victory at the time. But saying yes stripped the drama from the gesture. He wanted theatrics. I gave him paperwork. I signed consents for transfers of care, arranged a private room away from the gossiping visiting circle, and called my lawyer, someone I'd met years before, a pragmatic woman who'd become used to my tendency to plan. I moved myself in ways that surprised him, from being a dependent to someone insisting on her needs. He had always relied on the assumption that I would be there to negotiate the messy practicalities. When I declined to be that default, panic crept into his face. There is a particular cruelty to being left when you are at your lowest. But there is also clarity. Illness stripped away performances. I saw who paid the bills for a while because I had to let others manage, and who only paid attention when it came on television. I dealt with lawyers quietly, without the theatrics one might expect. I requested valuations, insisted that Emma's welfare be handled with approved legal guardianship structures, and told the people around me what I would accept and what I would not. The divorce papers were presented to me like a trophy. John looked at me for a reaction that would be satisfying to him. A small falter, a tear, a plea. I gave him a cool, steady stare and asked him one practical question. Who is looking after Emma when you and Emily move out? He had no answer. He hadn't thought that far. He'd assumed that loyalty to their plan would buy him everything without consequences. You can tell a lot about a person by how they respond to the question of a child's stability. Nobody who makes a child a co-conspirator should be surprised when the child needs a clear map later. After the papers, the mediation began. I won't go through the dry legal labyrinth. There are processes and forms, and I followed them. What mattered in the end wasn't the legalese, but the strategy I had built earlier. Having a solid income of my own meant I didn't have to fight for every cent. I could choose the terms that protected Emma and allowed me to remain a stable presence in her life. That economic independence wasn't a weapon to punish. It was a way to ensure I could continue to parent without being financially beholden to people who'd betrayed me. The real turning point came later. In a living room that had once hosted birthday cakes and holiday candles. This was my in-laws' house, a place that had been a second home for me for years. They had always liked me. They'd watched me grow, wipe chocolate from their grandchildren's faces, and laugh at dad jokes. They were stunned, though, at how the events had unfolded. John and Emily had expected them to be on their side. After all, appearances had been cultivated for years. They arrived for a confrontation with a sort of smug certainty, to assert that they were justified, that they had been brave enough to follow their hearts. I walked into that room, exhausted in a way that only long recoveries make you know, and sat down across from them. There were quiet murmurs, the kind of polite sound people make when they try to keep their voices steady. I'd asked everyone to come. It was time to speak frankly and to end the polite evasions. They wanted a spectacle, either a shameful confession or a begging apology. Instead, I opened my laptop and turned the screen so it was visible to everyone. For a moment, the world narrowed to the glow of numbers on a bank interface. I had redacted account details. The specific routing numbers were irrelevant and intentionally blurred. What no one could blur was the annual income figure, clearly labeled under a business account. $500,000 per year. I didn't make a speech. I simply said, "This is what I've been quietly earning with my work." The gasp that followed was not cinematic. It was ordinary human noise, a sound born of collision between assumption and fact. John's face did the thing it always did when he was trying to perform indignation, the smile that tries to convince you of sincerity. Emily went pale in a way that made her seem suddenly small. For all their bravado, neither of them had expected that my private life would be not just intact, but thriving. They had assumed I was fragile, that my illness would make me pliable, that my dependence would carve me into the shape they needed. I placed the laptop closed, meeting their eyes without triumph. I was not gloating. I was demonstrating something practical. Financial independence changes the set of choices available to you. When I saw the stunned faces of my former friends, I felt a calm that wasn't about revenge. It was a kind of vindication that had nothing to do with their suffering and everything to do with my safety. Consequences followed like predictable weather after a storm. John lost his job. Companies that had thought him a trustworthy figure withdrew their offers once the pattern of behavior came to light. There is a modern currency to scandal, even when it's quiet. Employers, friends, and social circles reevaluate the cost of association. Emily's family, who had once hosted her with open arms, found themselves grappling with the choice between loyalty and their own moral compass. They retreated in stages. It wasn't dramatic, just a series of shifted invitations, empty chairs at holiday tables, whispered conversations. For someone used to being the center of attention, that slow erosion can be devastating. I will say again, and I mean it, my aim was not to orchestrate their ruin. The unfolding of natural consequences was not my doing so much as the environment catching up to reality. They had made choices. People reacted. That reaction was not, in my mind, a cause for public celebration. I did not post about it. I didn't publish exposés or leak private messages. That would have been petty and cruel. Instead, I protected my child and made sure that Emma could live her life without being forced to choose between competing false narratives. Emma's reaction was the most fragile and the most important. She was young then, impressionable, kind, and bewildered. The moment she came to understand, she didn't run away from me. She stepped closer. There's a single memory that stays with me. Her small hand finding mine on a bench in the backyard while cicadas hummed, and her asking, in a voice with the pitch of someone trying on bravery, "Will you still read to me when I'm older?" I told her yes, and meant it. She's allowed to be angry at choices adults made. She's allowed to feel confusing things. My responsibility was to give her a steady adult who wouldn't force her into the middle or make her a battlefield. The practical fallout for Emily was harsh, but not wanted by me. She lost social standing, yes. Doors closed. She had to reckon with the fact that the narrative she'd believed could be shaped by impulse had real fallout. I saw her years later in a small apartment with boxes labeled Emma and court papers. She didn't ask for my sympathy. I wasn't going to give her the show she might have expected. But I did, once, speak to her in a corridor at a school event, not to gloat, but to say, quietly, "You made choices. Make them better for her." She looked at me then like a person who'd been left with a map and a long, hard trail to walk. As for me, the income from my books continued. An animation company optioned one of my series. That loosened licensing deals and allowed me to hire a small team. Plush prototypes that had once been an anxious hope became inventory sitting in a studio corner. There were camera calls, yes, and meetings that required suits, and trade show booths where I sold signed copies. None of that was about showing up the people who'd hurt me. It was about claiming the life that illness had tried to make impossible. George's role shifted during all of this. He had been a friend and moral compass early on, the person who asked uncomfortable questions when I needed them. He had approached the situation carefully, protecting his marriage at first, trying to salvage what he could. But loyalties change under pressure. He stepped forward as someone who wanted to ensure Emma's stability in practical, not performative ways. He would bring art supplies to my house, help with school pickups, and at times act as a buffer between Emma's bewilderment and the world's curiosity. His presence was steady without pressure. One evening, months after the confrontation in the living room, he sat with me on the porch and said, "You deserved better than to be treated like a backdrop." It wasn't a confession of romantic intention so much as a statement of recognition. There was a shift in us over time, not a dramatic romance written in soap opera lines, but the quiet reordering of living arrangements and emotional availability. He became, in the slow way that friendship turns into something else, a person I trusted with daily life. Trust rebuilds itself in small acts, picking up an extra load at the grocery store, showing up for a school play, texting an image of a silly lunchbox. Those small acts gradually add up to the possibility of companionship, not because they erase pain, but because they evidence reliability. If there is a future with George, it will be tender and cautious and adult in ways my younger self could not have imagined. I do not want this to sound like a victory lap. The cost was real. The years of illness, the betrayal of people I loved, the social exhaustion that comes from explaining yourself until you're tired of being convincing. But there was also a reclaiming of time, of agency, of the ability to choose who sits in your living room and who is allowed to speak for you. There's a scene I return to when I think about the arc. Emma, at 13, leaning against my kitchen counter, hair in a messy bun, using a bookmark from one of my books as a prop. She looked up and said, "One day I want to make things for kids too." I felt a rush of something that wasn't entirely pride and wasn't entirely relief. It was the quiet knowledge that the small, steady things I'd protected, stories, a nightlight, a hand on a cheek, had mattered. Sometimes people ask me, with that half-accusing, half-admiring tone, how I did it. The short answer is discipline and stubbornness. The longer answer is that I made myself worth protecting before I needed protection. I taught myself to make things that mattered, so my survival didn't depend on anyone else's charity. I didn't do it to trigger anyone's comeuppance or to make a show of their loss. I did it so I could stand on my own feet and, when necessary, pick up my child and carry on. There are quieter consequences that rippled outward too. The in-laws, who had once been pillars of acceptance, had to reevaluate what loyalty meant. They chose different allegiances in quiet ways. Some doors closed softly, others slammed. I lost some friendships that had been built on shared assumptions, not on knowing each other's hard edges. Meanwhile, new people entered my life. Readers who wrote that my books had soothed their anxious children at night, editors who became collaborators, a small, devoted team who cared about craft more than spectacle. As for John and Emily's public life, it narrowed. He drifted from job to job, the kind of client who once relied on charm, finding less currency in a world that now checked histories. She had to rebuild the life she'd worn like a costume. They both found, in different ways, that other people's sympathy is conditional. That is not a joy to behold. It's a sober truth. People who make choices that harm others must face consequences, and sometimes the world's way of balancing that is to move on and let social mechanisms do what they do. My books continued to sell. An independent filmmaker optioned the rights to one of the titles. We had meetings where storyboards and character bibles were discussed, where the idea of bringing a small illustrated world to screen felt like being entrusted with a child's new bedtime ritual. Merchandising came later, and with it an odd mix of commerce and joy. Bright vinyl figures that I'd once sketched on napkins now sat on shelves, their smiles manufactured, but their origin still mine. I won't pretend it's all rosy. There are nights when the past presses against the present, and the memory of a hand sliding a card across a table becomes a kind of ache. But those nights are finite. In the daylight, I am reclaiming ordinary pleasures. A cup of coffee on a weekend morning, writing the draft of a new picture book with a protagonist who is a little brave in the smallest ways. Recovery isn't only physical. It's the slow sorting of priorities, the putting away of expectations that never served me, and the choosing of people who do. If there's any lesson to be distilled here, it isn't a recipe for riches or a checklist of how to get even. It's a reminder that being quietly, consistently good at something matters. It's about making a life you can step into when the people closest to you decide to step out. It's about protecting children in the ways adults sometimes forget to, by ensuring stability, by offering truth without spectacle, and by modeling that loyalty is earned, not owed. I don't speak about financial numbers to flaunt. I speak of them because they shaped real options during a fragile season. The figure you've heard, $500,000 a year, wasn't a magic spell. It was the accumulation of years of disciplined work, small market wins, a handful of deals that multiplied, and a refusal to let a crisis outside my control dictate my fate. Where that leaves me now is, happily, in a place I didn't imagine when I was 27, sketching by lamplight. I am recovering. I have a studio with a team who get excited about marginalia. My books reach children who need them. Emma is growing into herself with a resilience I hope I helped nurture. George is there, quietly present, not insisting on labels. One day, perhaps, there will be a clearer definition of what the two of us are to each other. For now, we share dinners and ridiculous jokes and the rhythm of parenting. If you've stayed this far, thank you for listening to the long version. If stories like this, stories about survival, quiet reclamation, and the messy work of healing, resonate with you, consider subscribing. There are more tales here. Everyday people who quietly build their way out of impossible situations, not by spectacle, but by steady, stubborn craft. If you want to hear them, I'll tell them. I don't end with theatrical triumph. My life is ongoing, and that's a consolation of its own. There's the sound of pencils on paper in the morning, the glow of a laptop screen as sketches come alive, Emma's laughter as she invents a character who wears too many socks. There's the steady hum of a heater in a house that I pay for with my work. That hum is ordinary and reliable, and to me, the truest measure of victory.